name's Cormac Kinsella, and you're very, very welcome to the first night of the Dublin Festival of History Big Weekend. I'm the programmer of the Big Weekend, and this whole festival is lasting now for the next 2.5 weeks, and there's plenty of events both this weekend. So we'd love you to take a programme on the way out for the events that are on in this venue until Sunday night, but also the many events that are on in libraries around the city for the next 2.5 weeks. This festival is sponsored by Dublin City Council, and it's produced by Dublin City Libraries and the Dublin City Culture Company. I want to thank Brendan Teeling, the Deputy City Librarian, my fellow programmer Donal Fallon, and also Shree Sen and Heather McLeod from the Dublin City Council Culture Company for all their help. I also want to acknowledge the great support of Cormac and Sarah, who are signing this evening for people here and for people watching online. The Stardust tragedy was not just one of the greatest tragedies of late 20th century Ireland, but also one of the greatest scandals. The nightclub was a beacon for the city's nightlife until one fatal Valentine's weekend. In 1981, it became a nightmare. There was a series of inquiries afterwards. There was very little justice for the families. And tonight, this book started originally as a podcast by Sean Murray, Christine Bohan, and Nicky Murray, and then they wrote this book that was published recently called The Last Disco, which honours the memories of those who were lost, while also shedding light on the tragedy that still rocks the nation to this day. So tonight we're going to spend about 35 or 40 minutes teasing out the central themes in the book, and also providing the background for what happened on the night, and also what eventually brought some sort of justice to the survivors' families. So could you please welcome on the stage our three authors, Christine Bohan, Sean and Nick. Thank you. So sorry for stumbling over your names. Sorry. We'll also have time for questions after our session here, and then all three will be signing books afterwards. They're books for sale from Gutter Bookshop. And I just would like to ask one of the three of you to set the scene for Dublin in 1981. Tell us what sort of city it was.
Yeah, I might take that one. I think it was a very difficult time for people growing up in Dublin in 1981. We all know, emigration was very high at the time, unemployment was very high, there weren't a lot of jobs around. And obviously you can't talk about that era without talking about Charles Haughey starting the entire decade with his whole, as a community we're living beyond our means, which I think would have come as a surprise to an awful lot of people in living in Ireland back then. But particularly people living in Artane, where the Stardust was, where there were so many young people there who were already, working jobs in their late teens and their early 20s, and bringing that money home to their families, because it was just a very difficult time economically. And I think one thing to remember is that parts of Dublin were still very new back then. We don't think about it as much now, I don't think, but Artane, like in the 1950s, Artane was tiny. There was like 2,000 people living in Artane. And then by 1980, there were 35,000 people. So it was one of the many suburbs that had just grown massively in those years. And it's partly because Dublin Corporation, as it was back then, had built loads and loads of, had done a big, huge house building, or estate building programme back then to move people from the tenements in the city centre out to these brand new suburbs. And also there were people from the country, from rural Ireland, moving up to Dublin. My own parents did. I'd say a lot of people would be familiar with that. My dad moved up from Westmeath in the 1960s, so a lot of people would have done that. So it just meant that Artane was one of many, many suburbs that just saw a huge growth in the numbers of people living in there, which meant a lot of people looking for things to do, and which is why you got places like the Stardust being built, because you had so many young people looking for something to do.
I was just saying around to Sean that if you think of, there was 1,100 people in the Stardust that night, and in a city that size, it means that everybody knew somebody who knew somebody who was at the, which I don't think we realise now because of the size of the city we have now. Could one of you tell us about the Butterley family and the foundation of this disco, and what was the building beforehand?
Well, the building beforehand was a food factory, Scott's Foods. The Butterley family were kind of the well-to-do in North Dublin back in the day, and they had a very clear idea that they wanted to make money wherever they could. They would in various different businesses, and one of the things that they locked onto in the 70s when they took over the food factory was they wanted to open an entertainment complex. Now, it took a long time for them to get that past Dublin City Council, get through planning permission. At some stage, there was a plan for a bowling alley there alongside what eventually became the Stardust. And it was the thing to tap into because young people needed an outlet, young people needed a place to go, and the Stardust was one of them. Like, I'm from Ballyfermot in West Dublin, but the amount of people who I speak to from home who are of a certain age, they all know the Stardust, and they all went there as well, the odd time. But like back to the Burtleys, Patrick Burtley was kind of the patriarch of the family. Before he passed, he wrote his own memoirs called From Radishes to Riches, which kind of details his view of what his life was. His son Eamon, he chose to run the Stardust when it opened. The Stardust was a big complex. It had a pub called the Silver Swan. It had a function room, kind of restaurant called the Lantern Rooms, and then it had the Stardust itself. And from the very outset, it was about extracting as much profit from the business as they could.
That's very much what Patrick Butterley was all about, I think it's fair to say, because he did start out, there's a line in his memoir where he says, "I was always a devil for money," and that's something that runs throughout all of his businesses. He would try his hand at anything if it meant that he was able to turn a profit, he was a businessman, this is what he did. So he wasn't necessarily in the entertainment world, but he looked at discos and they were starting to boom in Ireland. He started one in the city centre, just on George's Quay, and at one stage he was bringing in £1,000 a week, and this was in the late 60s.
Yeah,
huge amount of money. And as it turned out, he actually didn't have planning permission for that, and there were fire safety issues with it, so he wasn't allowed to keep it going. He had to move it somewhere else, and that's why he moved it to the factory that Sean mentioned in Artane, because he just saw it as, this is a way to make money, I'm a businessman, this is what I'm going to do. And
he started out as a market gardener, I presume, did he then, with radishes? And that was North County Dublin, was he? He was Rush, was he?
Yeah. And Eamon Burtley, when he was given evidence at the recent inquests, he described himself as a farmer starting off. That was his trade starting off. But like the kind of things we're talking about there in terms of maximising profit and fire safety issues and things like that, those kind of things have always been tied up with the narrative of the Stardust, and like as what I'm sure we'll get to, like that was very key to this whole tragedy.
Yeah. And Nicky, tell us the importance of the Stardust in the community. We had Artane was a relatively new town, and if you think of that road going out, that there would have been very much gaps in that road. Now you start, at the bottom of the Howth Road, or the Malahide Road, is it? Malahide Road, and you go straight out, and there's houses all the way. But there would have been definite gaps in the late 70s, early 80s.
And I think the one thing that people often say is that it was such a beacon for people in the area, because there was that kind of these newer suburbs on the north side of Dublin, and as Christine mentioned, there's all these young people and they want to do something, and this was a huge thing for them,
And it was cool, and it was buzzy.
Yeah,
that came across.
It was a cool place to go to. You hear about the specials and everyone playing with that. They had an infamous gig just a few weeks before the fire. But as well, one thing that I think is when people are trying to understand about what the Stardust was like at the time, if people ever visit the site of it, that you kind of realise the scale of this nightclub. Now there's a car park there now as part of the.
And there's something in front of it, isn't there? There's
you can still, the facade of the building is still quite similar to the original, but you realise the scale of it. And this was a huge nightclub, and you'd have hundreds of people there so frequently, and because you had the Silver Swan, you had Lantern Rooms, you had Stars itself. It served so many functions within the community, but it was the place to be. Like the biggest show on the north side is one way it was described.
Like the survivors that we spoke to for the podcast starting off, they were like 16, 17, 18, 19 years old at the time. Yeah. And they say if they had the money, they go Friday night, they go out Saturday night, they go out Sunday night, and they go to Stardust, because Stardust had bands on, that people were into, they had DJs on playing the music that they were all into, and it was that area, but it was also from other parts of the city as well. It was one of those.
The specials played there, wasn't it?
Just a few weeks before the fire. The Irish Times described it as being halfway between a fracas and a fascist rally. It doesn't sound like the safest gig.
No, it doesn't. No.
But I think it speaks to the kind of the mixture of entertainment that people were looking for at the time, and that was being put on. Like when the Stardust opened in 1978, Joe Dolan did a residency for like 6 days. So you had kind of that kind of cabaret era, those kind of shows. But then it kind of moved into more discos and live bands as well.
Yeah, my mum saw Dickie Rock there. Yeah.
Great. She was at that gig. Okay, yeah, amazing. Yeah,
Perhaps several of his gigs, I would imagine. Yeah. Dickie Rock.
And I think that we describe it in the book as well, some of the only footage that there is of the Stardust. You can get it on the RT Archives website of Dickie Rock performing in it, and it is just, you can kind of see the excitement and the draw of it, you know, like it looks like a brilliant show.
Yeah,
really
it's so
like,
buzzy.
yeah.
One of the most extraordinary things about the book, everybody, which I would urge you to read, is the extraordinary kind of nearly forensic detail of the timeline of the night. And I think we should move on to that now. So, I mean, and I don't know which way you want to do it, but could we look through the timeline of the night of as well as you can? I'm not. This is a bit like asking a test now, but can we just go through the timeline, because it's really fascinating. When it all happened, when the trouble happened, and then the response to the trouble. So could we try that? Is that okay?
Some essential context before we get into the night itself was the practice that was in play at the Stardust, because from the management's point of view, there was something wrong with the Stardust, that the takings at the door weren't matching what the Boterleys' view was of how many people were actually inside. So they had to get to the bottom of it. Why does this not tally up? And the prevailing idea seemed to be that people were letting in their friends for free, going to emergency exits, kind of you pay in, then you open the door and let your friends go in. That seemed to be the prevailing idea among the management at the time. Now, at the inquest, we also heard suggestions that some of the doormen might have pocketed some of the money themselves. That was an allegation that was made as well. But something had to be done about it. So their idea was to, at certain points of the night, they would keep locks and chains on the emergency exit doors, including when people were on the premises at the start of the night, when people were on the premises. Now, it didn't seem to be one person's actual job to go and take those chains off at certain times. So that's kind of like and this had been highlighted by Dublin Corporation, which it was at the time. Dublin Corporation inspectors had gone in and said, "Here, look, you can't be having doors obstructed like this."
And was there any anecdotal evidence, any evidence, anecdotal or otherwise, of this happening anywhere else, or was it was there any? Did anyone say to you? Over the course of the inquiries, did anyone say, "But this is what everyone did," or there was no?
There has been suggestions of that right. This was a practice that may have been found in other places, but I suppose there were other factors involved in terms of the individual door, the individual chains, and everything. You know that we obviously saw that when the chains were not locked, it was a practice known as mock locking, where they'd be draped around the emergency exit bar on the door. That prevented the door from opening fully, you know. So that was the key element.
And if you were just looking at the door, if you saw the lock the chain draped over it, you would just maybe think it was locked as well, even if it wasn't.
Which is what happened on the night.
Yeah.
I think you might be able to speak to just on the timeline thing. Maybe you might be able to.
Yeah, and I suppose we were chatting about this only just a few minutes ago. Is that the timeline of the night itself is it's kind of difficult to piece together in some ways, because so much happened in such a short space of time and was witnessed by so many people as well. But there's also this. It's kind of surprising as well, and we tried to capture it as well as we could in the book, where there was this event unfolding in the club as the fire took hold, but the club was so busy and so packed and so big that some people didn't even realize this was happening at the time. The earliest indications really was that people kind of felt a rise in temperature in the room. Some people who were sitting close to a curtain, people thought that the heating had been turned on in the nightclub because it was a very cold night. But this was very late in the evening.
This is like 1:30.
Yeah,
just after 1:30.
The night was kind of winding down at this point.
Yeah, and so people found that very unusual, but kind of thought nothing of it at the time. And it was within minutes really that people started to either smell smoke. Some people saw a flicker behind these roller blinds. So the blinds are quite crucial in terms of picturing the situation in the nightclub, in that there was a main dancing area, there was tables and chairs, but there was also these tiered seating areas at the east and west end of the room. These were fenced off on nights when they weren't in use, and this was where the flicker behind the blinds was first started. And we have a lot of stories in terms of people seeing it from different angles or not seeing it on different times. I'm not sure where to go.
But the thing that really strikes with like the evidence we had at the inquest and people we spoke to, that everyone who saw at that early stage, so we're talking maybe after 1:30 in the night, there'd been a big disco dancing competition, people were having a great time. But this was just after 1:30. People start to see a fire, and everyone emphasizes that it was a small fire.
Tiny.
It was only a small fire in this corner of this tiered off area.
It was on a couple of the chairs. It was maybe, I think, a foot or two high.
Yeah.
So it wasn't a huge thing. And the thing that comes across a lot is that the people who saw it initially went, okay, that's a small fire. We'll tell somebody. It'll all be fine. You know, people didn't go, oh my God, like we need to get out. It was such a small thing. It didn't seem like you know, it can't be emphasized enough. This started out as such a tiny fire. So the people who saw it alerted staff. Staff, you know, went and called. We had a couple of people who were in the room called 999. And it from there, from that really tiny beginning, it just grew so quickly. So within the space of about like less than 10 minutes. Sorry, not even 10 minutes. Like from that initial beginning, the fire jumped onto a chair beside it, and then another chair beside it, and then began to kind of reach up towards the roof. And very, very quickly, as it went up like the walls and it got to the roof, it became like, well, how do you say, like almost like a tornado?
Yeah, it was, people describe it as tornadoes.
Going to the walls, there was carpet tiles on the walls, wasn't there?
Yeah, well, this is one of the most kind of tragic aspects of it when we're sitting 40 years later in a courtroom listening to the kind of technical makeup of the building, and like I remember one of the barristers literally they were making a point and they said there was carpets on the walls, and he repeated again, carpets on the walls. There was carpet tiles. It's always been very hard for me to picture carpet tiles, but there was carpet tiles on the walls, and they were able to show us simulations of the fire, and the fire being from its small beginnings, because the carpet tiles were not of the required kind of fire safety standard to be on a wall. The second the fire hits that, it just changes the situation in the club entirely. It shoots up that wall and then starts really spreading from the ceiling and beyond. It's like we managed to see some simulations done at the time, and it's terrifying to watch.
Yeah, there was
just
a famous video there's a lot of there was a lot of work done by a fire research station, they're called in the UK, where they reconstructed parts of the Stardust nightclub itself using either the same material or as close as possible. And they run a simulation test, and the video it's quite hard to watch because you see how quickly the fire takes hold, you see the smoke pouring out of it. But what's shocking is that in the simulation, the fire takes hold so quickly that the cameraman who's filming it is caught off guard, and the other people who are filming it have to go forward and grab him back. And as the camera pans out, you kind of see all the people who've been looking at the simulation kind of, they couldn't believe how quickly it spread, you know. And I think that's important to remember, that when we're describing how things unfolded, that it happened with such speed that there's one bouncer ran from the nightclub into the Silver Swan to alert Eamon Butterley and other people who were in the Silver Swan pub. And by the time he got back in again, and that's not a huge distance, and he was running, the fire was out of control at that stage, you know. And even as the fire was spreading and the smoke was billowing out of it, it took a while for everyone to realize and for the panic to spread through the club, because at first it was only visible through one of the sections of the blind was raised. And so that caught different people's eyes. And you know, a lot of people were kind of, maybe they were still out dancing, maybe they were filtering away, going home or whatever. But it was only as this blind was fully raised that everyone in the nightclub realized what happened.
Like people were going to get their coats. People saw the fire and went back to get their coats.
It just gives a visual on these blinds when you're calling them that they're floor to ceiling height.
Yeah.
And then are we looking about 10 feet wide? Are we?
Yeah, they're quite wide. Yeah.
It'd be as if
there were about 5 of them, and so they were kind of surrounding the area where the fire was. So, say people who first saw the fire, they kind of peeked behind one of them, and then as the fire was getting bigger, there was one person who pulled up several of the blinds, which allowed the fire to be seen by everybody in the room. And the stage was at the other kind of side of the room, so some people who were still dancing would have had their backs to the fire and wouldn't have realised, you know, initially that would have been what was going on behind them.
Yeah, and like but once it's kind of generally realised in the club that this is so dangerous and it's we all need to get out of here. That thing that we talked about earlier, the practice of keeping the doors locked at certain points of the night
this all
comes into play.
So we're looking. It went from someone looking into an area where there's 2 chairs like that on fire, and suddenly within 5-6 minutes.
Not even.
Not even.
Yeah,
You've got walls, ceiling.
Walls,
drops
ceiling,
from the ceilings,
kind of coming across the ceiling, coming down.
And at that stage, someone called the Pier Street or fire station.
The emergency services were called. And it was one of the strange quirks of it as well, is that one of the bouncers in the Stardust that night was also a fireman. Being the bouncer was his kind of part-time gig or whatever. And after the first 999 call was made, he also rang, and he was able to kind of speak the fireman language, and it was able to impress upon them that this is absolutely deadly serious. We could have multiple fatalities. We will have multiple fatalities here tonight. You need to get every resource you can here right now.
Because there had been a breakdown in communication, wasn't there, between the guards and or wasn't there some about the language that the different names of the different plans?
Well, that came later when all the emergency service kind of converged and realised what a catastrophe they were dealing with. But like at that time, when those initial calls are being made, people are then trying to get out. Like, I think it's human nature. Like, the natural thing to do for a lot of people would be to try and get out the way you came in, which would have been the main entrance. So a lot of people tried to get out the main entrance, but because it was a very kind of narrow foyer to get in, a lot of people kind of got kind of trapped and crushed, etc. There, there was a period where also the doors were closed. So the way it was described is that there was people got out initially, but the doors swung back, and there was some kind of locking mechanism in there that kept that locked for like even seconds were crucial when we're talking about a fire this devastating. So that led to a lot of people in a very small, cramped space. The doors eventually opened again, and a lot of people got out that way. But the people who tried to get out some of the other exits, there was an exit behind the stage, which all evidence points to that being locked at the time of the fire. That was an emergency exit that should not have been locked. There's like no reason for that to have been locked while people were on the premises, but that was locked at the time of the fire. There's like evidence to suggest some of the other ones were also locked as well, but these were emergency exits. These would have been close to the dance floor where people had been. You're looking around, where's the nearest exit here? It's the kind of thing I imagine everyone would do, but these doors were obstructed, there was stuff in the way, there was chains on them as well. So it's such a horrific thing to imagine.
And the reports into it found that people acted rationally. And that's the thing, as Sean says, like there were 6 emergency exits, and people, as you said, tried to get out like the main one that they came in, but when they went to other ones that were close by them, like they did exactly what you're supposed to do. But because of the doors, and also there was like a lack of training among the staff within the Stardust. Like there'd never been a fire drill carried out. There'd never been any instructions. Like the staff didn't know what to do. If the staff had known what to do, there was one estimate that they might have been able to evacuate the entire building within, I think, a minute and a half. And because that leadership wasn't there, that sense of fire safety awareness or fire safety training, because seconds make all the difference in a fire. And because they didn't know what to do, the people were left to fend for themselves and try to do what they could to get out.
I mean, and also, the emergency service in Dublin hadn't seen anything like this really since the Civil War, probably. They just hadn't seen anything like this. So
most firemen who were on duty that night, they would not have experienced anything even close to this. So you have a lot of people who are attending this, and firstly, it's the level of call that it was in terms of the amount of resources mobilised. That hadn't really happened at all, in the country. And I think there is the elements in terms of the panic when they first arrived, that there were so many people outside the nightclub that it was hard for the emergency services to get to the building, and people were panicked trying to find their friends. And there was also confusion among the firemen themselves in terms of where hydrants were. It took a lot of time for certain hydrants to be located. There were some hydrants that were beside the Stardust, but they were incorrectly labelled, and they could have hooked them up to them earlier, but they didn't see them. And one of the crucial things about the fire and the response is that it exposed a lot of holes in terms of how Dublin Fire Brigade was operating at the time. There are minor things. There was, well, I would say minor, but there was one fewer breathing apparatus on one fire engines than there should have been, which meant that one fewer fireman was able to get in and help people. There was inadequate training, and all of this completely changed after the Stardust. This really kind of overhauled how the emergency service responded. And to go back to what you touched on earlier on, there was even the confusion in terms of between the fire brigade and the Gardaí in terms of what this major emergency plan that they had to put into place, what it actually meant. They had different versions of the plans in Tara Street Fire Station and in Garda HQ. They weren't sure who to send out, who to call, because you have to call the Dublin or the Defence Forces, Dublin Airport, mobilise all those resources and get as many as you could there. However, that was all put into place, but the fire was so quick and burned through the building so quickly that by the time those resources were on their way, they were so down, there was nothing that could be done at that stage.
But the initial firemen who got there, some of them showed incredible bravery, and they went in. When they went into the Stardust, there were some people still trapped inside. some people in the panic and in the dark had found their way into bathrooms. And this is another fact that always really strikes when you hear it. As part of this drive to make sure that no one was able to get in for free or no one was able to pass any drink through the windows, they had the management had put big metal bars against the windows. So you were essentially walking into, there was no natural light in there. You couldn't get through the windows in there. So people who found themselves in the bathrooms were essentially trapped. And the brave firemen who went in, and it was all these years later, sitting at the inquests, listening to these kind of old men now describe and going in there. It was humbling to hear, and it was incredible bravery to save quite a few people.
From so many powerful stories from the inquest, but also even from we'll get on to the Keane Tribunal as well, but there is a strong element of the firemen really acted so bravely in terms of one in particular was praised for the fact that he took a great risk in that he was sharing his breathing apparatus with the people who he was bringing out of the nightclub, and this was filled with very dense, dark smoke, and because of that he was able to save their lives and get them out.
And also the hospitals hadn't seen anything like this. At the Mater was the first protocol, I think, wasn't it? And then
every hospital was.
Yeah.
Every hospital was overrun, and then in some of the stories you hear in the days that followed, family members who were trying to track down their loved ones, they had to go to every hospital because there was no way of finding out where someone might be. So it was really a crisis mode, and taxis were bringing people to hospital. There was Gardaí putting people into cars, bringing them to hospital. Ambulances bringing people to hospital.
Ambulances were going on, taxis were going to one hospital and sent on somewhere else. When that was the
it depend on the space that they had. And
it was so chaotic. The systems just weren't in place. Even at any stage of it, when an actual major emergency happens, Ireland wasn't prepared. There was, the systems weren't in place. But even say the fire safety inspections beforehand, they weren't there. They weren't in place. It was just this huge failure by so many different systems. There was so many different failures along the way that could have been averted.
So then the government then reacted very quickly in terms of the inquiry. But there was a great Charlie Haughey was his area, so he was straight up. And then wasn't he told to get himself and Noel Brown were told to get out of one funeral because of the?
When you're after going through a trauma like that, having Charles Haughey coming for a press op to grease the palms, I'm sure it wasn't well received by some people, and totally understandable. The politicians said all the things that politicians will say in the aftermath of this thing. Total sympathies with what happened. This is a terrible tragedy. We're going to get to the bottom of this, and we'll make sure it doesn't happen again, kind of thing. All the politicians were saying that, but the Keane Tribunal, which was set up to get to the bottom of this.
What struck me is how quickly that tribunal was scrambled. That really was just, let's get this thing done.
I think we've never really seen anything like that in Ireland. I think now we're so used to tribunals taking such a long time. Sean
but it was just set up so quickly. Was it 11 weeks before it was?
So Charles Haughey actually announced it the day, a day and a half after the fire. He announced it on the Sunday, and it started 6 weeks after the fire had taken place. And it was all wrapped up by November of that year, and the report came out, I think 16 months after the fire had happened. And in Ireland, we're so used to tribunals taking 8 years, 15 years. It's just a very different landscape. It was done so much more quickly, which in some ways was good. But at the time, a lot of people were still in hospital at a very basic level. People were still traumatized. Having it happen so quickly meant a lot of people couldn't actually participate in it because they weren't physically able to do it. So look, it was good in a way that the country was seen to act fast on it, but practically speaking, it probably wasn't the best thing to do.
We're talking about there were kids there then, 16, 17, really young people were hauled in front of a tribunal with all these judges, all these barristers, and quizzed about what they saw. After being through a traumatic event, some of them had lost friends that night as well, and I don't think we do it that way today for sure, and it's definitely not the right way to go about it.
Wasn't there a problem with legal representation as well, that the survivors' families weren't allowed their own?
Yeah, literally on the very first day, a lawyer had turned up to represent a large number of the families, and basically he said, he wasn't allowed to do it because the government had appointed 2 particular barristers to represent the families and said, these are who's going to represent the families, these are the ones we're going to pay the legal aid for, we will not be paying for anybody else. And the families had said, some of these families had said, we would like a choice, we would like the option of saying who we want to represent us. But basically, if the government was paying the fees, they weren't paying this barrister and this solicitor's fees. So he had to step aside and say to these families, you need to be represented by someone else. And I think that speaks to, again, the kind of as Sean says, the kind of the way things wouldn't be done like that if it happened nowadays.
Yeah.
I think there'd be more sensitivity and there'd be more awareness of why families couldn't have their own lawyers representing them.
Nicky, you might talk us through the key findings of the inquiry and as a result of the key findings, the key problems.
Well, I mean, I suppose the one main thing to realise about the Keane Tribunal, if you don't realise already, is that after it was such an extensive tribunal, I mean, the amount of detail that it went into is huge, and the report is online. You can read it. It's readable. It's not too dense. It goes into a lot of technical details at some stages, but it explored so many aspects of the night itself. So much witness testimony, expert testimony. But obviously the key finding of it is that in the face of no one really being sure exactly how this fire could have started, the decision was made to come to the finding that it was probably arson, which is in itself a very unusual finding.
It's so when you're actually reading the tribunal report, it's so odd because, like as Nicky says, it's so forensically written, and there is a huge amount of detail in it, and a lot of interviews done with it. Like in a lot of ways, it's very well done. But then it comes to the part where it's deciding what caused the fire, what led to the fire, and it puts out a couple of theories. It says things like, a waitress could have left a bag of rubbish and it went on fire, or he's got a couple of suggestions of things that could have caused it.
The immersion was one, wasn't it?
The immersion was one, and he rules that out. He says it probably wasn't that, but as it turned out, that was not quite right. And then, literally out of nowhere, when you're reading the report, he just says, looking at all of these, I think most likely the cause was probably deliberate, and there's there's nothing to back it up. It almost feels like I've asked lawyers about this. We've all read the tribunal report so many times and tried to understand why he said it was arson, because this set the tone for so many years. This changed the course of everything then. And the best explanation I can come up with is that he felt, Mr. Justice Ronan Keane, who led the tribunal, and the assessors who worked with him, felt like they needed to give a cause of the fire, that it wasn't enough for them just to put all the evidence out there and all the information out there and let people make their decisions. And to be fair, he does cast a huge amount of blame on a lot of people. Like he looks at, obviously, the Patrick and Eamon Butterley, Dublin Corporation, the Department of Environment, all these people. They're castigated. Like
there's bits where he will actually call out the evidence of some of the doormen who were in the club and said that what they were saying, he can't really treat it with much gravity or attach much weight to what they were saying.
And it's very direct. And then you come to this part, and I think for all the work that we've put into this, we've never fully understood why he decided to say, why it was decided in the report to say that it was probable.
And the repercussions of him saying that it was probable arson. So a tribunal of inquiry is what the government does when something horrific happens and they want to get to the bottom of it. We've had so many of them. But it's like the government saying, okay, this is the final word on something. And so the final word on this was an incredibly unsatisfactory one that was probably arson. It was essentially telling people from that community that one of your own
at its worst.
One of your own did it, which is horrific. But one of the key fallouts from that is, based on that finding, the Butterleys then could sue Dublin Corporation for quite a lot of money. They got £500,000 at the time, which was an insane amount of money for damage to their building caused by this arsonist who there was none, never found, but they were able to claim a significant amount of money. And at the same time, families of the bereaved were like kind of fighting with the government to try and get some kind of form of compensation. At the time. It was when you're reading the news reports at the time and you're seeing this and then you're seeing that, it leaves a sour taste, I think, to see those two things play out.
That's appalling. So then, it was quite soon after the inquiry was published that the campaign for justice started. So tell us about John Keegan.
So John Keegan, I suppose actually we'll dial it back just a couple of years previous, that it was. It would have been 1982 when the initial stages of families coming together and saying that they weren't happy with the findings of the Keane Tribunal. There were questions around access to healthcare and medical bills that were being paid, who would pay those. And it was in the very early stages, families started to come together, and try to get some action and try to right really the wrong that they saw in the finding of the Keane Tribunal.
Wasn't there a fund set up as well? Some sort of fund?
There was a disaster fund initially. And after a while it kind of petered out a little bit, that campaign. And it wasn't until John Keegan took it on board in 83.
I'm going to get the year wrong. He had lost 2 daughters in the fire, and I think for the people who had lost people, so for the families who had lost people, it just felt like nobody else was going to help them. That they were, that there had been public support, as you say, money donated towards helping them, but at the end of the day, they needed more, and it wasn't. Nobody was coming to help them. So it was like they had to organise, they had to do this all themselves. So Sean and Nicky might be able to speak more to that about how they organised.
Yeah, so obviously John Keegan lost Mary Martina in the fire, and his daughter Antoinette Keegan obviously went on to lead the campaign so much in recent years. But once he took over kind of leading the families, that their campaigns kind of kicked up a little notch. There was more protests being held, there was more plans for rallies. The story of the Stardust started to get back into the headlines after it kind of had started to slip out of them a little bit. And the main drive was, is that either there is some redress needed here, some compensation in some way, shape or form, in some way for the state to acknowledge what had happened, which there hadn't been. Families were able to take cases in terms of the malicious damages claim that the Butteries were successful in. However, those cases dragged on much, much longer than the Butteries case did. And eventually it came to a head when the compensation tribunal was organised. And this was essentially that people who had lost loved ones in the Stardust fire or were injured, that they would be able to appear before this tribunal, which was a lot more casual, a lot more small scale than Keane Tribunal or anything else that we'd be familiar with. And they would discuss with a panel in terms of what happened, their loss, their injuries, and the tribunal would come to some sort of monetary compensation for them. However, there was hugely mixed views on this. Many people who were at this tribunal would have referred to it as shut-up money, that the state was kind of looking to make this go away in some way, shape or form. The money in some cases was very, very small. John Keegan in particular, he took a High Court case and a Supreme Court case over the fact that in the eyes of the tribunal, that he wouldn't be compensated beyond, I believe the figure was £7,500 for the loss of his daughters, because what he was experiencing was quote-unquote mere grief, and it didn't go beyond that. So it didn't go, in terms of, in the eyes of the tribunal, anything that was worth giving anything more than kind of the base payment.
I think that's like to take a kind of step back a little bit, like that example is just kind of symptomatic of how the Irish state treated the families and survivors for so long. It was a sense of, oh geez, they're asking for something again, what can we do to make them go away, having not actually addressed the grave injustice that had been done upon them and their families. Like successive governments gave them short shrift for years. So like and that's one of the tragedies of this whole thing, is that it took so long to get where we eventually got to this year. Like that line, mere grief. I remember when we were making the podcast, I read that line and I just couldn't believe that how callous the kind of mechanisms of the state were against people who were bereaved by this horrible tragedy, that like all these kids went out for a night out and didn't come home. Yeah, it's horrific the way they were treated for so long. So like it took so long for it to happen, and it's great that it did, but it's a stain.
Well, it's a complete abrogation of any civic responsibility on the government's part. Like to roll out a line like that is absolutely appalling. Yeah.
And I think it draws a line. Sorry, I was just going to say, I think it like Stardust isn't the only time that's happened. Like we've seen this happen multiple times in the state, where there's a tragedy or a disaster, which is bad enough on its own, but then the way that the state deals with it or treats the people, it creates almost a second tragedy or disaster. It like re-traumatizes people all over again. So you've Stardust, but then you say the Dublin Monaghan bombings, the Whiddy Island disaster, the Glen of Amal, even the way the redress for the mother and baby homes at the moment is being done. It's like the state is just bad at justice. It just can't quite get it right. And to be fair, when people will have seen Simon Harris doing the apology earlier this year, which was well done, but I mean it shouldn't have taken 43 years. It just shows that the state is not good at doing this. It should all have been. It could all have been avoided. And
so, like from that like mid-80s point where they're talking about compensation. Now, just to say, on that compensation tribunal, the requirement for you to get that money was to give up any court case that you had been pursuing. It was that was the quid pro quo of that, which was kind of horrible in itself. But then, like, the next few decades are just characterized by different family members, like some being involved at some points and some being involved in others. They would come together at various points to be like, what can we do now?
Yeah.
Because the doors were closed to them at every opportunity.
And also in terms of just human nature, I mean, like how wearing that is on the psyche. I mean, do we have to do this again? I mean, are we going back again to ask for the same thing?
Yeah, the lack of closure.
Like there was one man who I spoke to who sadly passed away. He didn't see the inquest, Eugene Kelly. And I remember interviewing him. He lost his brother Robert in the Stardust. His brother Robert's only 17 years old. They kind of idolized each other. He was like they were thick as thieves. And I asked him, did he ever like kind of seek help? Did he try and get counselling? And he goes, how can I get counselling? How can I get over this when we don't have justice for what happened? We don't have the answers to what happened. And I think that's sustained a lot of people for so long that we're going to keep going here because eventually they have to give us some chance of closure, because we know that it definitely wasn't arson. We know that the carpet tiles were on the walls. We know that the doors had chains on them. We need to find a mechanism to progress this forward, and that thankfully that became what the inquests were, the fresh inquests into the fire.
We should jump to the inquest because I'm conscious we're running out of time. So, do you want to take that, Sean? The start, if you like, the most recent inquests and how they started, and was there a key? You know?
Yeah, so the Phoenix Law are a Belfast-based law firm, and they came on board, I think 2017, 2018, with the families. And for a long time, the families been calling for new inquiries. We had the Keane inquiry that gave answers that people were not happy with. Let's do a new inquiry. Ireland doesn't like doing new inquiries. So when Ireland has had its, like when official Ireland has had to say.
Unlike referenda, we don't like inquiries.
So so a guy called Darragh Mackin, who's a solicitor of Phoenix Law, they flipped it and said, okay, the inquests that were held for these people at the time, inquest and inquiry into someone's death, were not adequate at all, and they're very provably not adequate into investigating how these people died. Let's call for new inquests. And they were drawing parallels with Hillsborough in Britain, where they called for new inquests, and that was the path for them to get justice for the 96 who died. Those inquests found that they were all unlawfully killed, and that was a bit of a template for that the Stardust families could follow, and they were granted new inquests in 2019.
Just on that before we get into the inquests as well, is that obviously there were some original inquests. They were very, very quick, very, very brief, but the approach in the years before this had been looking for new evidences to the cause of the fire or what happened on the night, and there have been a lot of different pieces of evidence put forward, but there was 2 other times that the government examined this evidence, but there was nothing that they saw fit as warranting a new inquiry. And some of the evidence put forward, you can kind of see that it did raise new questions, but in the eyes of the government, it wasn't anything they didn't want to revisit it. They were willing to revisit it in that surface level, but it wasn't until the inquests came along that this was a new approach it from a different angle, and that was the way in.
And they argued it was in the public interest to have a look at this again, because like 48 young people died in such a horrible tragedy, and we don't have answers as to why. Like that's not something that.
But you also have these families come back in again to answer questions again. I mean, this is just. I mean, how many times did they have to do it?
And it's to their eternal credit. So when the inquest started, it started with a process called the pen portraits. So that gave family members of each person, each member of the deceased, a chance to go up and stand on a podium like that and talk about their loved one. And it was very emotional a few weeks sitting in the court listening to it, because it really humanized everyone. It really gave you a sense of who these people were, like their hopes and their dreams. And it was just a perfect tone setter, because for so long the Stardust families have been kind of given short shrift and told to go away essentially and whatever else, but this put them front and center in their own kind of in their quest for justice and their story for justice. So that's how the inquest started, and then it took it on from there. We heard from the doormen at Stardust again. We heard about those practices of draping the chains.
And these are all men in their 60s now.
Yeah. We heard from Eamon Butterley himself. He was kind of grilled for 8 days in the witness box, and his past statements were put to him, and inconsistencies in what he was saying then and now were put to him. So that was very interesting to see. But then we had survivors talking about their own experiences, and these were people who were teenagers at the time, now in their 50s and 60s, talking about the worst thing that has probably ever happened to them, and they're talking about these horrible experiences. Like, there was one woman really struck me who lost one of her friends, and she had promised the friend's mother that she would bring her home, and she could never walk up that road again afterwards because she felt such guilt at making it out. So, like, it went on for a year. Every day there was really striking evidence. Every day there was evidence to kind of make you kind of take your breath away, kind of thing. You had modern fire experts having a look at it. You had the Gardaí, the firemen, coming back in as well, and it all culminated in, like, I don't think anyone who was there on the day of the jury's verdict will ever forget being in the room when they said those words, unlawful killing. It was one of the most powerful, emotional things I've ever seen. It was the culmination of 43 years of searching and looking for justice, and the pain that they went through and the trauma, and everything was just poured out into a room like smaller than this.
Yes, yeah.
And it wasn't a given as well, that was the verdict. We were talking to some of the lawyers in the days beforehand, saying, is it going to be unlawful killing? Is this what they're going to come back with? Because there were like 5 options that they could have returned. It could have been like a narrative version, which would just, a narrative verdict, or, you know, there were different options open to them, but unlawful killing was kind of what I think it's fair to say the families are hoping for. But it was really unclear. The bar for that was so high. It was, you know, it wasn't a given. I think people look at it now and think, of course that was always going to, I mean, they were unlawfully killed, but the way that the jury had to come to that decision, it was really difficult. They could have not done it. You know, they could have, so it was brilliant that they actually did.
But it was great to witness that when the evidence was all put out very clearly about what happened on the night, about how the makeup of the building, that it was made with these tiles on the walls that should not have been on the walls, that there was the practice of the chains on the doors, and that the staff had no fire training, etc. When you put all those facts together, it obviously allowed the jury to come to the verdict that they
What
did.
I think is extraordinary is that all those facts were there and had been there for years.
At the time they were
there. So
that's the thing.
That's the maddening thing about it. Is
the family members, a family member of someone who died in the fire said to me when we were writing the book, said, I hope you don't say that there was loads of new information in that inquest, because there wasn't. Like, a lot of what was said, we knew that like literally the day after the fire. Like, that was all knowledge, you know, and it came out in the Keane Tribunal too. Like, the information was there all along.
And that's another reason why it's kind of so hard to fathom why it took so long. Because that information was there. And I mean, like, Simon Harris was only fresh in the job as Taoiseach when he made the apology, but it was literally the least that he could do as the head of government because of what they've been through for so long. It was so long overdue, and it's great that it's great that it finally happened.
Now we've time for maybe 2 or 3 questions. So there's one here. Could you just wait for the microphone? Thanks very much.